in this episode.
So Freud was trying to do exactly what we're trying to do today, with one huge difference, namely that there was no data on the neurophysiological and neuroanatomical side. It was literally impossible to study anything about the living brain and its workings. The only method they had was dissection of of the cadaver at autopsy, and then microscopic study of its elements. But those methods don't tell you anything about what's going on in the brain when somebody is conscious versus unconscious, when they're in a state of resistance, when they're in this or that affective state, and so on. So Freud was obliged to abandon the effort because it was just pure speculation. He was just imagining what kind of neurophysiology and neuroanatomy might correspond to the functional dynamics that he had inferred. So ironically, and I really want to emphasize this, ironically, because Freud was a good scientist, he abandoned neuroscience. So many people think it's the opposite. Freud was a good neuroscientist and then he abandoned science for psychology. But no, it was quite the other way around. In order to still have access to empirical data, to be actually able to observe the things that he was studying, to be able to make predictions, if I do this, then that will happen, which is the essence of science. He could only do that on the psychological side. And so in order to advance the science of the mind, Freud had to stick with purely psychological observations. And of course, the crucial thing is that that's no longer the case. We now have methods, many powerful methods. And so that's why we've been able to pick up again where Freud left off, as he always hoped his intellectual or scientific heirs would do.
Neuropsychoanalysis is a realization of Sigmund Freud's project for a scientific psychology. It's an attempt to study psychoanalytic concepts such as the id, ego, and superego through empirical techniques in modern neuroscience. Neuropsychoanalysts pay special attention to subjective experience and the unconscious, which is generally ignored by the brain sciences in order to stick to the third-person view of the current paradigm of science. Jacques Lacan is perhaps one of Freud's most renowned and, at least till now, controversial adherents. Lacan analyzed Freudian concepts through structuralism in linguistics and anthropology, introducing further topological abstractions into what Freud discovered, with a special emphasis on language, signifiers, and unconscious enjoyment, or jouissance as Lacanians call it. In this episode, Professor Mark Solms, one of the founders of neuropsychoanalysis, discuss prospects for a Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis with John Dall'Aglio, who's done groundbreaking work in bringing together two historically severed worlds. Moderating this dialogue was an utter privilege for me, and I want to thank Mark and Joan for their patience with the slew of technical issues we faced. Probably the worst I've had since starting this podcast. Thanks for that, Riverside Studio. If any of you know better softwares for podcast streaming, please email me. And now, let's get to the episode after a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always going to be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode. Lovely. But as I was telling to you, Joan, Professor Solms, thanks so much for being here. It's truly a privilege. Been following your work for a long time, and I've learned a lot from your work. On that note, I I'll probably start off. I'm sure you've spoken about this and written about this in other places extensively, but just for this kind of maybe you're bringing together two
Rahul, I'm not
audiences.
sure if you realize, but you're very pixelated. John and I are clear, but you breaking up.
But
Okay.
to now that we put the technical issues behind, where were we? Yeah, I was gonna say, thanks both for being here. And regarding,
It's hard to hear you, Rahul. I'm not sure what you're saying.
huh, the camera
Maybe
is
switch
fine.
off your camera, Rahul, and then we'll just hear you.
Not sure why the audio isn't. Okay, we'll try with the camera off, but I kind of want to. Let me know if I'm still not audible or if there are any more issues.
The sound is good now.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you. Where will we? Oh yeah, I guess the first question that I kind of want to, kind of as like an introductory question to kick off, would be to you, Professor Solms. As a person coming from more from a neuroscience, neuropsychology background, I'm curious how initially you came across Freud and psychoanalysis, and what piqued your interest in those subjects. And you've written beautifully about it in your book, The Hidden Spring, too. But just for the audience, could we start off by a bit of an introduction there? But then also, perhaps as a bit more specific to the topic today, before you came across John's work in Lacanian Neuropsychoanalysis, what were your general views on Lacan and Lacanian theory?
Okay, so thank you. I'll answer the first question first. The I became interested in psychoanalysis in two parallel ways. The first is that I was dismayed upon training in neuropsychology, which you would think is the branch of neuroscience where you will learn about the mind, that there was no mind there. It was we treated the brain as though it were exactly the same as any other organ. In other words, we were studying only we were studying it as an object, and as far as mental functions were concerned, we were studying them objectively. Like you would the functions of the heart or the functions of the lungs. These are the mechanisms whereby these functions are performed. But there was no experience. There was no mental phenomenology. And if you asked about that, which is by far the most interesting thing about the mind, is that there's something it's like to be a mind. If you ask questions about that, like how come you actually experience this visual information processing, and how come a memory is actually, relived as a movie in your mind's eye, and so on. You were just told that these are not scientific questions, and you shouldn't ask questions like that. It's bad for your career. So that made the frustration with neuropsychology made me look around for, well, if you can't study the mind in neuropsychology, then where can you study it? And that led me via all sorts of serendipitous things, led me to psychoanalysis, where clearly the starting point of psychoanalytical investigation is lived experience, both psychoanalysis as a science and as a treatment. So that was one way I was led to psychoanalysis and became interested in it. The other was my doctoral research in neuropsychology was on brain mechanisms of sleep and dreaming. And so Freud obviously is a major figure in the history of the study of scientific study of dreaming. And so there was a seminar being taught, of all things, by a professor of comparative literature, an open seminar in my university. And so I attended it. And this chap, who happens to have been a Lacanian, as it turns out, his name was Jean-Pierre Delaporte, he said you can't understand Freud's interpretation of dreams, or at least chapter 7 of it, unless you first of all read his project for a scientific psychology. So he inducted us into this incredible paper that Freud wrote in 1895, which was really his swan song as a neuroscientist, his attempt to grapple with neuropsychology from the point of view of what he had learnt in the early years of psychoanalysis. And after reading that and learning that Freud had been a neuroscientist and learning about his work on aphasia and so on, I was hooked, and I knew this was the discipline for me. This is what I had been looking for in the first place. So that's my answer to your first question. Sorry, I'm probably being too verbose. So I'll answer your second question much more briefly. You asked, what did I think of Lacanian psychoanalysis those days? Well, first of all, I knew nothing about psychoanalysis other than Freud. All that I knew about was Freud. Then I decided I wanted to train in psychoanalysis. I moved to London. And to my dismay, it was most certainly not a Freudian psychoanalytic institute. It was the British Psychoanalytic Society, was Kleinian. So I then had to get my head around Klein. And in the process, I learned a bit about, all sorts of other things in psychoanalysis, including Lacan, but really only a bit. And it was, to be honest, basically incomprehensible to me. Klein had been hard enough, and then Lacan, was just like, oh my God, this guy I don't understand either. So that was my first impression before I met John.
Yeah, I'm grateful for lucid Lacanians like John who can write on Lacan without the Lacanianisms, so to speak. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Professor Solms. Yeah, along the same lines to yourself, John, can you tell us about how you got interested in neuropsychoanalysis as a Lacanian, or perhaps was it the other way around where you were, initially interested in neuropsychoanalysis and then came into Lacanian theory?
Yeah, so I fortunately didn't have the challenge Mark had, because neuropsychoanalysis already existed by the time I was coming into these things. But I had a seminar in my last year of high school. It was like an elective seminar. And it was on neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Very, very basic kind of ideas in these different fields. And it was the first time that I studied anything in neuroscience and psychology. And so, we watched these like Nova Science things on like the brain and prefrontal cortex, amygdala, very kind of kind of bare bones stuff. And then the psychology section of the course was taught by the school's school psychologist, and he was a little older. So for him, what psychology was classical Freudian ego psychology. So what we read were some papers, introductory remarks on more like structural model stuff, ego and id. And so as we were reading it, and this is the first time I came across anything Freudian, I was like, this is interesting. I found it to be a kind of like a compelling story about mental conflict and everything. And very naively, I was just like, this kind of sounds similar. The brain stuff was talking about like a rational prefrontal response versus a impulsive amygdala response. And then now we're reading this thing about, an ego versus an id kind of response. And so I just Googled neuroscience psychoanalysis. And I came across this YouTube video titled The Conscious Id. And I said to myself, that's not right. I learned that the id is unconscious. What's this? So this person's clearly wrong. So I clicked on the video, and then I was blown away. And so and so for the audience, Mark has this fantastic paper, and there's a video of the talk on YouTube, the conscious id, and I was blown away by the ability and the research and the work that had been done to map psychoanalytic concepts to brain systems and brain networks. And then not only that, but then also not only can you make this kind of bridge, but then you can revise or recommend or suggest changes from one field to the other based on those connections. And so I learned about that, and then that's what hooked me. And so at that point, I just started reading and listening to as many things on neuropsychoanalysis as I could. So it started with that. And it was after neuropsychoanalysis that I started reading more directly Freud and psychoanalysis in my undergrad. And so at my undergrad, I wanted to do this combination. And of course, there are no degrees in neuropsychoanalysis. So my plan was I majored in cognitive neuroscience as sort of studying higher mental functions and their relationship to brain stuff. And in all my other sort of free spots in my schedule, I just looked for any course on psychoanalysis that I could find. So this meant I was taking things in comparative literature, American studies, gender sexuality studies, modern culture media. So every single humanities department, because it wasn't in the cognitive science department. And I just happened to have to take classes on Lacan if I wanted to take anything on psychoanalysis. It's more or less what was just offered. So I just happened to come into Lacan stuff. And my entire experience reading psychoanalysis at that time, and still now too, but all psychoanalysis was, how can I think about this neuropsychologically too? Because my kind of entrance was with both at the same time. My entrance into this was both psychoanalysis and neuroscience. So whenever I was reading things in psychoanalysis, I was thinking, how could we work this out in the brain? Or like, how could I make sense of this in brain stuff? And then vice versa. Everything that I was taking in cognitive neuroscience, I was also thinking, okay, what would the like psychoanalytic perspective on this be? Or, where would those more dynamic processes be contributing? And so that was the entry. And it's kind of been in that sense.
Wonderful. Well, I would probably just start with a bit of a foundational question here. So Freud, as we know, had this project for scientific psychology. And I'm wondering, Professor Solms, if you could comment a bit on that, and just for the audience too, who aren't experts in psychoanalysis, what that project was, what was the intent behind it, and do you see neuropsychoanalysis sort of the continuation or even the actualization of that project?
Gladly. But first, Rahul, I've noticed you calling me Professor Solms and you're calling John. So do please call me Mark.
Absolutely, that's fine.
Yeah.
Totally, Mark works.
Well, by the time that Freud wrote that project in 1895, he had already had quite a bit of experience in terms of studying what was then called hysteria in patients with what we now call functional neurological disorders. He had quite a lot of experience, first of all, under the tutelage of Charcot, and then over the next 9 odd years back in Vienna. So he'd made some sort of fairly fundamental observations about the psychodynamics of hysteria, that part of the mind is unconscious, part of it's conscious, that there's a resistance to gaining access to what's unconscious. This is all governed by feelings and so on. And so as a neurologist, which is what he was, he wanted to translate what he had learnt in what we would nowadays call functionalist terms. In other words, the inferences that he'd made from the psychological observations as to what the mechanisms are that are at work here. He tried to translate those mechanisms into neurophysiological and neuroanatomical terms. So that was really the beginning of what we would now call neuropsychoanalysis. That's what neuropsychoanalysis is all about. We're saying, well, you've got 2 sets of observables, they're the subjective mental states and then the objective bodily organs. And what unites them is an underlying functional apparatus. So Freud was trying to do exactly what we're trying to do today, with one huge difference, namely that there was no data on the neurophysiological and neuroanatomical side. It was literally impossible to study anything about the living brain and its workings. The only method they had was dissection of the cadaver at autopsy, and then microscopic study of its elements. But those methods don't tell you anything about what's going on in the brain when somebody is conscious versus unconscious, when they're in a state of resistance, when they're in this or that affective state, and so on. So Freud was obliged to abandon the effort because it was just pure speculation. He was just imagining what kind of neurophysiology and neuroanatomy might correspond to the functional dynamics that he had inferred. So ironically, and I really want to emphasize this, ironically, because Freud was a good scientist, he abandoned neuroscience. So many people think it's the opposite. Freud was a good neuroscientist and then he abandoned science for psychology. But no, it was quite the other way around. In order to still have access to empirical data, to be actually able to observe the things that he was studying, to be able to make predictions, if I do this, then that will happen, which is the essence of science. He could only do that on the psychological side. And so in order to advance the science of the mind, Freud had to stick with purely psychological observations. And of course, the crucial thing is that that's no longer the case. We now have methods, many powerful methods. And so that's why we've been able to pick up again where Freud left off, as he always hoped his intellectual or scientific heirs would do.
Wonderful. John, would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, as I've been working on some other Lacan stuff, it's actually, and this isn't usually recognized. I think it's relatively well recognized, at least that Freud was a neurologist, and then whether people, say he abandoned neurology versus, as Mark is saying, he was a good scientist, and therefore that's why he invented psychoanalysis. Lacan actually was trained in neuropsychiatry before he became a psychoanalyst. And it's well known that Lacan trained as a psychiatrist before, but the training milieu in early, what would that be, 20th century France was very much like all the main academic psychiatric places, they were run by neurologists. And they were all actually, it's funny because if you trace the academic lineage, it goes back to Charcot as well. So they were all run by neurologists. And it's really interesting. There are these early case presentations that Lacan co-authored with other sort of trainees and stuff, and they're all neuropsychiatric patients. And so when I found these, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. No one's ever talked about this either. And by neuropsychiatric, I mean, and they were mainly post-encephalitic patients. So patients who had, sort of due to infection, encephalitis of the central nervous system in the brain. And so lots of kind of quasi-Parkinsonian and also very interesting sort of confabulatory delusional presentations as well. And so I was going through these, and these are kind of before he writes these kind of key papers on his own position. So he's basically still an intern or a medical resident at this point when he's doing these papers. And it's really interesting because I think that the trajectory is kind of similar to Freud, where Freud invents psychoanalysis to stay true to the phenomenon of mental experience and to try to capture it as best he can with that method. And when Lacan writes about this kind of transition point, when he's critiquing current organicist theories of mental phenomena, the critique, at least the way that I read it, and also the critique of some people at that time in 1920s, 1930s, 1935 in France, who were trying to already at that point integrate organic theories, Hewlings-Jackson's dissolution model with psychoanalysis at that time in France. His critique was that the sort of the purely deficit model that you get from that and the sort of explanation by reduction to non-mental, i.e. purely automatic biological processes, or rather an interpretation of biological processes as just automatic, not in any way intentional or meaningful. That's the critique. And then his sort of manifesto at this point, he kind of writes about, and this is also in his doctoral thesis, looking at personality as kind of the proper level of analysis to be making sense of these mental phenomena, in psychosis especially. And then he defines personality as a quote unquote, a set of specialized functional relationships between man and his particular environment, the social environment. And so again, when I was reading this, it's like, oh, look, there's that key signifier, function. And that, so it's this really interesting, I think, parallel between Lacan and Freud. And just the other thing I'll add on the project, another, I think, important point that unlike some analysts, Lacan doesn't sort of dismiss the project as neuroscientific baggage. When you read his engagements with the project, it's very nuanced, Lacan's remarks on it, and he's not rejecting the idea of there being anything relevance that comes up from the biology. In fact, his interpretation of the project, I think it's already directing or moving toward more like computational light versions, because he was already interested in game theory at this point, and cybernetics was becoming a thing as he's kind of doing this writing. So yeah, that's sorry, that's a bit rambly, but that's what came to mind for that.
No, that's wonderful. So just as a primer for the audience, John, if maybe obviously you can't cover the whole thing in a few minutes, but can you give, to use a very vulgar term, the elevator pitch of what is Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis?
Okay, yeah. So the elevator pitch version would be neuropsychoanalysis in Freudian sense. It's thinking about relationship between neuroscience and psychoanalysis, and creating that bridge using a certain set of concepts. And so if you're coming from a Freudian background, then you're using, Freudian concepts. And almost all of us in psychoanalysis do, because, Freud is the kind of bedrock here. For me, Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis is doing the same thing with Lacanian concepts. And Lacan develops his concepts in dense dialogue with Freud, in his reading and rereading and sort of his own kind of updating of Freudian theory. And so in my work, I focus especially on Lacan's register theory. So the real, imaginary, symbolic, which is really a key kind of theme throughout his teaching, and he uses these to think and think through a lot of things that he's sorting out. And for background, a very simplified version would be that the imaginary register, it sort of refers to this domain or this experience of organization, cohesion, consistency. I feel myself to be a consistent existing thing over time. My ego has that continuity, thank goodness. The symbolic being the register mainly of, or usually thought through in terms of language, but really the register of differential organizations. And sort of it's working within the lens of structuralism and sort of how differential elements are important for creating structure and creating and undergirding structure. So like the distinction between me and not me is a signifying distinction that isn't immediately apparent. And the real being the register of basically what insists in not being represented, either through the imaginary or the symbolic, what escapes symbolization. And so with those sort of three key concepts, trying to think through, okay, how can we look at these from a neuroscientific perspective? What lens does this add to the brain? And what I try to focus on is really centralizing this role of the real as what is sort of not fully explained or made sense of or resolved by various processes that might be correlated with ideas like symbolic or imaginary things. And from there, it comes at this idea of jouissance, which is Lacan's way of thinking through libido, drive. It's a kind of energetics in his model, and the idea that not only is fully solving the real or fully getting rid of jouissance impossible, but really the impossibility of getting rid of that is at the basis of psychic life. That it's the impossibility of fully getting rid of drive excitation and the strange enjoyment that we get from not fully getting rid of our drive excitation that is the wellspring of our symptoms, our singularity, our subjective experience, and all of the kind of identifications that we build around that to try to tame it. And we do tame it to a degree, but that's kind of still the insistent motor force. And so keeping that kind of lens on the brain, that's how I see a lot of the Lacanian contribution.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. Almost called Mark Professor again. That was a bit of a slip. So, Mark, what are your views on what John just articulated, in the sense that do you see this as a continuation of what you set out or what you foresaw neuropsychoanalysis to be, or do you think it's something a bit different to what you wanted to do with neuropsychoanalysis?
No, I think it is fundamentally the same and an extension in the sense of an advance of what I did. So let me say, first of all, just like John, he said he wanted to learn about psychoanalysis, and what was on offer was Lacan. I wanted to learn about psychoanalysis. What was on offer was Freud, and then subsequently Klein in my clinical training. So, you take what you're given, and that those are the concepts that sort of frame your own way of thinking about these things. I think that it's fortunate that I came before John, in that Freud is more foundational than Lacan, and so this is what I mean by what he's doing is an advance. Now, if there were equivalent minds like John's, I mean, John is really a particularly creative and intelligent chap. We're very lucky to have him.
I concur.
I wish that there were equivalents in other schools of psychoanalysis, because all of them are developments of Freud. The one thing that unites all psychoanalytical schools is that they start from Freud and then try to progress our understanding, but they do it in multiple different ways, in multiple different directions, frequently developing partial aspects. They're particularly interested in one pathology, or they're particularly interested in one developmental phase, or one sort of aspect of clinical work. And so they, as much as they all are advances, they're kind of fragmentary. So this is I always try to retranslate them back into the language of Freud so that I can understand them. And I think that translating Freud in turn into the language of neuroscience, which we now can do in exactly the way that John described, it enables us to unify not only via Freud, which is going backwards in time, but also via neuropsychoanalysis, which is going forwards. Try to unify all these different strands. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is that when John started to translate in the way that he's just described, first of all in principle and then in content, Lacanian concepts into neuropsychoanalytical language, I understood for the first time what Lacan was getting, what he was on about, because and this is exactly what I'm saying, I think is something we should aspire to in general. John's done that for Lacanian psychoanalysis. He's translating it into a language which is accessible to people outside of the church of Lacan, and the same applies to all of our other churches, in psychoanalysis. It's a big problem in psychoanalysis, not only these different schools within it, but we only talk to ourselves, so it's no surprise we're not going to have any influence on the rest of mental science if we're not in any kind of engagement with it. And so I think what people like John and I are doing is a really important service for the future viability of psychoanalysis, not reducing it to neuroscience, replacing it with neuroscience. It's engaging with the language and the findings of the rest of mental science so that we can be part of the game. Then, in terms of the actual content of what John said, I think that this idea, which I had never understood before, I encountered John's translation of it, of jouissance. What he says, what John says, and I'm assuming this is a faithful rendition of what the concept's about in its original form. I mean, it makes absolute sense from the point of view of what we understand about the mental instrument from the point of view of contemporary neuroscience. The attempt to minimize uncertainty or to get rid of uncertainty. When he speaks about the real, he's speaking about the uncertain, the unknowable. And so what we are seeking to do most fundamentally, if the mind is a prediction machine, it's trying to reduce the uncertainty in its predictions. In other words, it's building up a model of the world, and it is trying to minimize the difference between its model and the actual world. It never can be achieved because a model is a model and the world is the world, and all you have access to is your model of the world. So there's this gap that between the imaginary and the symbolic on the one hand and the real on the other, which is exactly the thing that he's talking about. Now he says something very interesting, that there is some sort of pleasure in this gap. You know, that there's a it's not a frustration only, which it is in part, because otherwise why would we be trying to reduce it? But the fact that we never can actually get there, the fact that there is some thrill in that is a fascinating observation, which I think we can make sense of. If I can just put it in a thumbnail form, there's this wonderful line in the Talking Heads song, Heaven, and the line goes like this: heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. So who wants to be in heaven? That's Freud's nirvana, where nothing ever happens. In other words, it's death. So it's of the essence of life that we are constantly striving to get to something which we can't get to, in the sense of no uncertainty is just death. So uncertainty is fundamental to being alive, and translating that into the language of affect. Nirvana means nothingness. There's no affect. The drive demand is moving away from what we call homeostasis, nirvana, where there's no demand. Drive demand is unpleasurable, and returning toward homeostasis is pleasurable. Getting to homeostasis is boring. That's where nothing happens. So all of the consciousness and all of the feeling, positive and negative, happens in this in-between space, which is actually, because of the reality being unknowable, where we always are. We are always striving for nirvana, for heaven, but never getting there. And so then you have to ask, but why is there a pleasure in jouissance? It's not just, well, it's good to have feeling as opposed to no feeling. It's that there's a positive kind of lust in this, a positive desire in this, an excitement in this. And I think that the way we can understand that is in terms of what we in affective neuroscience call the seeking drive. It is that in regard to many of our drives, we're trying to reduce uncertainty. In other words, we're trying to get into homeostasis, but the seeking drive is positively engaging with uncertainty. In other words, what is pleasurable for seeking is to find something new, to find something unknown, to find something that is beyond what I'm already master of. In other words, it's an engagement with the real in the language that that John has introduced me to and that is familiar to the two of you. It's a positive engagement with what's not known, and it is literally what we know of the phenomenology of the seeking system. It is exciting, it's invigorating, it's arousing. Everything about seeking has the phenomenal qualities that that seem to attach to this concept of jouissance. So I think it's the fact that this is a fundamental insight of Lacan's, certainly not in Freud. That concept, in fact, Freud was always very puzzled. Why don't we just go straight to orgasm? You know, what's all this? What's all of this foreplay and dilly-dallying and excitement? You know, until we get to the nothingness. He couldn't comprehend it. And he had a really half-baked theory about, well, it must be some kind of increase and decrease of tension over a particular period of time. And I find Lacan's explanation much better, to the extent I've understood it through John. If I can translate it back into affective neuroscientific terms, there are consumatory affects and there are repetitive affects, and seeking is an appetitive affect. The pleasure is in the appetite, it's in the desire, not in the consummation of the desire.
So, John, when you gave your talk at the Active Inference Institute and kind of presented Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis to these more computational neuroscientists, Mark remarked that one of his worries were that you both won't have any disagreements. So I'm going to put that onus on you, and I'm going to ask from you, where do you think you both probably have differing views, or at least let's call it constructive disagreements? And perhaps if you have any questions in that regard, you could, if I may say, ask them here. And I also want to mention here, you did email to me that 2 points you want to discuss in particular is the role of language and then the role of fantasy. But regardless, I'll just, you can start off wherever you want to start with.
Yeah, I think if heavens where nothing happens, I'm going to be sent to Lacanian hell if I don't bring up language at some point by the Lacanians here. But I think, and just to add, and I think this is consistent with work within neuropsychoanalysis too, and Mark's work certainly, that there's not only seeking, there are these other drive systems as well, and perhaps we'll talk about that. And when I write about jouissance and when I've thought through jouissance, I agree very much that the positive appetitive enjoyment in the excitation very much parallels seeking. Now, the tricky part is with the Lacanians, and this is a critique that Darian Leader, for example, has as well with Lacanians. Basically, all affect is kind of reduced to jouissance, at least for some. And I think it's less helpful to do that. I think the Panksepp work is really helpful in the sense to let's keep our concepts separate. Then there are different kinds, qualitatively distinct kinds of affects, and so in like Lacanian cases too, you'll see that they'll be writing like the jouissance of the rage, or the jouissance of the anxiety and the symptom, where like clearly the person isn't feeling jouissance in the enjoyment sense, at least consciously. And the idea is that it's an unconscious enjoyment, which that does have its Freudian roots as well. The unconscious satisfaction afforded by the symptom. And I think, and maybe this is a good segue to one of the ideas that I think I tried to formulate, and then I couldn't make the follow-up talk, Mark. So I'll ask it here. When you talk about the prioritization of one of the different emotions in situations of uncertainty, where there's the organism. Not only does the organism need to minimize free energy, uncertainty, but unfortunately there are many different categories of uncertainty in seeking. Rage, you don't want to be have obstacles with your goals. Fear, you want to be safe from threats to your body, and panic, you want to stay close to caregivers. So we have all of these different sort of categories of homeostasis that we need to minimize. And then so when you're in an uncertain situation, especially situations of conflict, say on the one hand, mommy has left, and so I feel lots of anxiety and separation. On the other hand, mommy has left. How dare she leave? I want to tear her to bits. Then you have a conflict. That's uncertainty. What do you do? And so Mark talks about needing to prioritize one over the other. And I've wondered about thinking through one level of sort of psychopathology or psychical organization as an automatization of which emotion or which system tends to get prioritized. And in the sense of to give some context, this is like the idea of the fantasy in Lacanian theory, that you have this real, uncertainty. You have perhaps your own symptomatic way of enjoying it, a particular mode of enjoyment, and this is laid down very.
I'm suddenly not hearing.
I think, Sean, your microphone turned off. You're back. You're back. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the last thing that? Great. I was misheard.
In fact,
you spoke about the enjoyment of the patient in the symptom.
Enjoyment symptom. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the idea being that there is this sort of a core symptom that gets developed, and this is a particular mode of dealing with uncertainty, a particular mode of enjoyment, and around this is sort of constructed through layers of identifications, symbolic and imaginary elaborations, a fantasy. A fantasy organization that includes a certain relationship with the other, and I've wondered if another sort of layer in terms of, Mark, how you've thought about things clinically, if it is a space for not just an automatization of non-declarative repressed predictions, which I've correlated to this idea of, okay, there's some kind of symptom that the patient repeats, and there's a kind of enjoyment in that, and this kind of automaticity there. But in addition to that, an automatized way of which system gets prioritized in the relationship between me and the other, broadly or patternedly speaking. Like, this person tends to or prioritizes, say, panic, where another person prioritizes, fear, and that becomes a layer on top of the symptom, I guess, a relational automatization in a certain sense.
So let me first of all say a word about what you said as a preliminary comment about jouissance in relation to affect in general. And you said, well, let's keep the concepts a little more precise. I actually have some sympathy with the idea that there's jouissance in all affect, in the sense that there is seeking in all affect. So seeking is a fundamental drive to engage with what is uncertain. And it is the default drive in that when you are uncertain about how to find safety, which we call fear, then you are seeking safety. So you're not seeking in and of itself. You have deployed seeking in the service of another drive. So now I'm seeking safety, or I'm seeking mother, or I'm seeking a sexual union, or I'm seeking to pacify my fretful baby, or whatever. When you're doing those things, you're still seeking. In other words, you're still engaging with trying to reduce uncertainty, but it's trying to you're engaging with the uncertainty in a particular task-oriented category. If you're not bothered with all of that, then you can default to seeking in and of itself, which is just engaging with the world because the world is interesting. It's a luxury to be able to do that. So I think that maps onto what you just described, that in a manner of speaking, seeking is involved in all affectivity. It's just that, as you say, one gains greater precision by calling seeking only that default mode where you're seeking for its own sake rather than seeking in the service of some other need. So I also know that Rahul wanted to speak about psychosis. There's a special place for seeking in psychosis in relation to what I've just said. So if we get to psychosis, I'll build upon what I just said. Now I turn to the heft of what John's asking about, and I think there might be a few misunderstandings here. So first of all, let me say that we have to prioritize one need over the others, precisely because you can't do everything at the same time. So while I'm seeking safety, I can't also look for mother and explore the world generally. Which one are you going to do? You got to choose. So while you are prioritizing the one, the others don't disappear as needs, but they are not currently the prioritized one. In other words, the one that is driving your voluntary activity. So the other ones are relegated to automaticity. In other words, to your currently best available predictive model about how to deal with those things. That gets put onto the back burner, and you run them all. And in technical terms, that means there's fixed precisions in relation to all of those action policies, and the uncertain precision, the modulating, fluctuating precision, where you're palpating, are things turning out as I expected them to? That's what voluntary behavior is all about, where you're making choices. So the prioritization has to do with what is voluntary. What is voluntary means where am I changing my mind on the fly as things are or are not turning out as expected. So that's prioritization. It's nothing to do with psychopathology. That's got to do with action selection and the bottleneck in terms of, well, as I put it, you can't do everything at the same time. So now when it comes to pathology, as you say, we have conflicts. Well, first of all, each one of our emotional drives is hard enough to learn how to satisfy them because of the nature of the real. The world is a bloody unpredictable place. And so, you're always going to have uncertainty about how to meet all of your needs. So each one of them is there's always some uncertainty in relation to them. But when they conflict with each other, as they do, I mean, just like big time, then you don't only have to come up with the prediction as to how do I satisfy this drive in itself. It is how do I satisfy this drive given that it conflicts with that drive, and how do I satisfy that drive given that it conflicts with this drive. And then you have to come up with predictions which don't pertain to one drive, but to two or more simultaneously. Now, that is what Freud calls compromise formation, or what Freud calls drive fusion, if you want to look at it from the point of view of the drives rather than the point of view of the representations. It's what Melanie Klein calls integration of part-object relations into whole-object relations. So this process in health, you are not prioritizing one drive. You're recognizing I have many, and you're trying to find compromises or integrative object relationships, which partially, in a compromised way, in a balanced way, are dealing with multiple drives simultaneously. The psychopathology arises from efforts to do this which go too badly wrong. It always goes somewhat wrong, but if it goes too badly wrong, what the child does is it gives up the attempt to grapple with this conflict, and it says it works like this, even though it doesn't work like this. So that's what, in neuropsychoanalytical terms, that's repression, putting the problem out of mind. In other words, the conscious grappling with the problem is a foregone in favor of automaticity. In other words, now the child always deals with the problem this way or that way. If it had integrated the two drives, then the problem would be to a certain extent solved. If they can't solve the conflict, then you haven't integrated the drive. So this is why the one or the other comes to dominate consciousness. So the prioritization of drive in normal functioning, that I spoke about first of all, is not the same concept as the fact that one suffers from a particular feeling. That's because one has not managed to deal with the demands of one particular drive because it conflicts with other drives. So the solution the child comes up with is not a compromise formation which adequately resolves both. One then is favored at the expense of the other, and so the patient suffers from a particular feeling. There's a particular quality to their emotional distress, which announces which drive has the most illegitimately automatized prediction attached to it. Now, you must remember the child puts the problem out of mind for a good reason. It's because it's distressing, it's overwhelming, and they can't find any solution to it. So there's a relief in saying it works like this when it doesn't work like that. And so this is the essence of why Freud says that in a symptom, there's an attempt to fulfill a wish. The layperson or the non-psychoanalyst says, symptoms are, how can they be wishful? They're horrible things. Yes, it's an attempt to satisfy the drive. And it is, and the child giving up on attempting further is in order to not be distressed any further by their failure to be able to achieve more than that. And so this is why they resist allowing the problem to re-enter the mind. So we cling to our symptoms because they bring us relief in relation to something which is overwhelming. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that addresses your point. But I'd be very happy to clarify further if I've missed something at the end of what you were asking.
Yeah, I think so. Just to give kind of the background, what I'm trying to think through is the difference between the sort of core of the symptom and the kind of various things that get built around it. And the reason I'm asking this is because, and Mark, I wonder what you think about this. Is I guess the hope at the end of the quote unquote successful analysis, whatever that would look like, is the hope that there would be, as you're kind of putting it now, a new solution or a new kind of compromise formation that does account for the 2+, the 7+ drives in a better way that gets sort of automatized alongside the original putting out of mind pathogenic solution that the child laid down, versus, and this is the Lacanian idea of reduction of symptom to symptom, and it's this idea that when it kind of takes very from the get-go, like nothing works, and there's you're kind of stuck with your symptom. But what can happen is a changed relationship with the symptom, so that there's let me try to think of an example. There's an automatized pattern or an automatized solution of, I don't know, let's say to take in, to take in, and perhaps this takes a manifest form initially of, say, an eating disorder, and that it's not maybe this is the same, but the idea being that it's not getting rid of that original symptom, that it's changing the relationship with it, that perhaps the conscious feeling associated with that pattern or with that solution, or the feeling that comes with it, is on the one hand less distressing and overwhelming, and on the other hand is something that allows the person to continue in life. Perhaps it metaphorizes it into these are very simple examples, but a taking in of knowledge, or a taking in of something else, in that sense, where it's not that there's a new solution, it's that the core is still there, but it's related to in a different way, or in a way that is less only getting acted out or played out in one particularly fixated manifestation.
So, as always, this is why I enjoy doing what we're doing now. This is what we were discussing earlier in our conversation, where I can engage with the Lacanian concept that I didn't even know existed, and I can translate it into my terms, and in this instance, I find that Lacan evidently believed something that I myself have come to believe, in contradistinction to my Freudian colleagues, or at least my Freudian colleagues were rather dismayed when I came to conclusions which seem to me to be pretty similar to what you've just described. So let me just explain what I mean by that. So by a symptom, I mean the core, what you call the core of the symptom, is what Freud called the attempt to fulfill a wish. In other words, that's the core. That the patient has a conflict. They have to satisfy these drive demands. They can't come up with a way of doing it that satisfies them both, and so they say, "Well, I'm putting this problem out of mind. I'm saying that if I do this, then it'll all work." But it doesn't, and so they suffer that feeling because they've dealt with this feeling, but they dealt with this need and they haven't dealt with that one. And this is what we call the repressed prediction. So therefore, the prematurely automatized or illegitimately automatized prediction equals wish. In other words, this is their they believe this to be true, even though it's not true. If I do this, then I will satisfy my needs. Now what do we do in psychoanalytical treatment? We try to bring the problem back to consciousness. In other words, we problematize what they are doing. What the patient is doing is what we call transference. They're enacting their prediction. And this gives us opportunity to see it, because the patient can't remember it. It's unconscious. It's repressed. So what they are doing, and this is a very old Freudian idea, what they are doing betrays, as it were, what the unconscious wish or prediction is. And that, because they're doing it, we can draw the patient's attention to it, and we can say, "You're doing this. In fact, you're doing this rather a lot. You're doing this over and over again." And then the question is, why are you doing this? Well, it seems as if in doing this, you're hoping to achieve that. And please notice, you're not achieving that. So that's why you're suffering. That's sort of like the essence of what a transference interpretation is. Now, that does not do away with the original prediction. This is the crucial point. This is the point that my colleagues, at least initially, were rather... I said, you can't undo repressions. They are permanent structures. The patient will still... so even though they know consciously, yes, I'm doing that, and then they'll say, "Shit, I did it again." And that's because, of course, they have no choice in the matter, because they're not there. It's unconscious. It's not in the realm of me. It's in the realm of... It's not in. It's in the realm of what is automatized. In other words, not in your hands. It just runs through you. The enactment happens regardless of your own intentionality. Once you've done this enough, worked it through, you did it again, and the patient eventually says, "Shit, I did it again." Then you come to this magical moment where the patient says, "I'm doing it again," while they're doing it. And then at that point, you have choice. Now you can change your mind and you can say, even though I'm still inclined to do this, I can decide to do something else. And the inclination to do it will never go away. So, this is why we can always go back to our bad old ways, because our bad old ways are always still there. And a very good example is addiction, but it's by no means the only one. So the prediction is still there, and you can choose to do something else despite your inclination. That's the best we can hope for in terms of. So now that begins to sound like what you're calling changing your relationship with your symptom. And it's not the only way that you can change it. In other words, you don't necessarily have to decide, I choose to do something else. It may be, now that I understand why I'm doing this, I choose to continue to do it. It still seems to me to be the best I can come up with. But you're not in the same relationship to the symptom. You're not the victim of the symptom. You're not passive in the face of the symptom. You have ownership of your symptom. And I've given you two examples there, of changing your relationship to the symptom. And I very much doubt that exhausts the range of ways in which you can change your relationship to your symptom. But I think that the crucial thing in what you're saying and attributing to Lacan is that the core of the symptom doesn't go away. It's just your relationship to it. That to me is maps directly onto the conclusion I was led to for various reasons. Including the cognitive neuroscientific fact that non-declarative memories cannot be reconsolidated. You can add to them, but you can't change them. So I just want to add a footnote, though, which is that that's not you said it correctly, that's the core of the symptom. There are other things which are important parts of symptomatic pictures, and a very important part of them is defenses. So let me just clarify that I don't believe repression is just one of the many mechanisms of defense. I think that there's repression first, and then there's defenses second. Repression is an attempt to satisfy a drive or to resolve a conflict between a drive. That is unrealistic. It doesn't work. But you automatize it anyway. That will necessarily lead to the fact that a need is not being met means you're going to suffer that need. You're going to feel it. And then we institute defenses against the feeling. Defenses are not attempts to meet the underlying drive. They're mopping up exercises. Okay, now I'm suffering this feeling. I don't know why, but let me get rid of the feeling by snorting cocaine or by some other like eating disorders you mentioned. For the most part, are defenses against the failure. Or in the face of the failure of a repressed prediction. So defenses are much more malleable things. And so things that can change in terms of your relationship to your symptom can also have a lot to do with defenses. So, for example, many sleeping disorders arise from panic grief, the panic grief drive, separation distress problems. But then sleeping disorders take on a life of their own. You can analyze the underlying cause of the sleeping disorder. You might still be left with the symptom, or you might treat cognitive behaviorally the symptom. You're still going to be left with the underlying cause. So there are all sorts of complexities there that are very interesting. While I'm talking of defenses, sorry, I just need to add one more thing, which is so important for mental health, is that for the very greatest part, psychopharmacological drugs act like defenses. They are ways of getting rid of the feeling without treating the underlying cause. And so, psychopharmacological treatments, I'm not saying that they're a bad thing, and I'm not even saying they're an inessential thing. I think, thank God for psychopharmacological treatments in terms of managing symptoms which, like suicidality, or people who are so depressed that they just can't come to treatment. You need to treat the symptoms, and sometimes symptoms are just the result of recent trauma, and so on. So in those cases, symptomatic treatment is all that's needed. But it's very important for people to know that they're not treating the cause, that they only treat the symptoms. And and therefore they function just like defenses. They are getting rid of the feeling without addressing where the feeling comes from. I suddenly have coming into my mind, like, for example, in lust, one of our famous drives in the history of psychoanalysis, if a person has erectile dysfunction because of something to do with the way that they've dealt with their lust drive, and you just treat it with Viagra, you haven't treated the problem, and this happens a lot, especially in, of course, elderly men get erectile dysfunction for physiological reasons. But in young people, we have erectile dysfunction and they're treated with Viagra. They're not treating the problem. And SSRIs are the same. It's given like Smarties, and nobody sorts out their lives. But I really am rambling now. Sorry. Let's come back to the main story.
I promise this will be the only interruption. In the past few years, I truly have cherished connecting with all you listeners of this podcast, whether through email, video calls, or simply the comments. And I'd hate to lose this fledgling community we've built around our shared love for philosophy and science, and so I'm kindly asking you to consider subscribing to this podcast on Substack. Let's cut the BS. In our techno-feudalist times, no platform is perfect, and at the end of the day, these companies own us. However, if I may naively be hopeful, Substack at least allows me to export email addresses for me to keep connected with you all if one of these platforms decides to kick me off for some reason, which, as we're well aware, they've done in the past with no explanation. In fact, this almost happened to me recently. So please, let's stay connected through Substack, and if all else fails, at least the good old SMT protocol. That is a nerdy joke for you programmers out there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think that the working of the defenses is in the sort of the Lacanian terms. That's the layers and layers and layers of symbolic and imaginary stuff that's gotten put on top of the symptom. This is how in like the Freudian child is being beaten, the kind of reversals of who's in the subject position, who's in the object position, and then here's all the realm of interpretation, and the slip as indicating maybe one of the kind of routes that the thing is taken, but and the idea is still that in the clinical work, you've done this work of interpretation, you've meandered through the particular subjective history in the moment, and then you come upon this sort of rock in the road of this thing that just does not budge, and that being the ultimately this kind of core of the symptom, and this being I think I forget if I've put it this way at points, but the kind of the Lacanian railing against homeostasis being the recognition of this, that there's something that doesn't admit of this kind of solution, that there's something in the symptom that just stays as it is, and that you therefore need to come to some kind of terms with it. But I'm also wondering if Rahul, you had mentioned psychosis, and perhaps the talk of different ego organizations and defenses is a route to talk about psychosis, if you wanted to.
Yes, please go ahead, because I think.
Sorry, I'm not sure I'm following. Are you asking me to say something about psychosis?
Yeah, because I think, Mark, you had a comment to make before on psychosis, and I want to be mindful of the time, so therefore, go ahead, please.
Yes, so just in terms of time, I have 16 minutes to go, and then I will have to go.
That's
about
fine.
Psychosis, and it's not that I have any particular need to talk about psychosis. It's just in the email you sent before our meeting, unless I'm confabulating, which would be hilarious. I think you said that you would like, if there's time, to speak about psychosis. So, and does neuropsychoanalysis have anything to say about psychosis? So
there is one question, yes.
Yeah, it does.
You're correct, there is a question.
It builds very much on what I've just said, because in psychosis, the one tool that we have is antipsychotic drugs, which are dopamine blockers, which are symptomatic treatments, and which act on the seeking drive. There's all sorts of very good evidence that the seeking drive is indeed fundamentally implicated in psychosis. One of them is the one I've just mentioned, that if you give psychotic patients antipsychotic drugs, in other words, you block D2 type dopamine transmission, in other words, you block the seeking system, then, at least their positive symptoms are reduced, hallucinations and delusions. And conversely, if you take enough dopamine, as I've tested out on myself, you eventually become psychotic, and you can bet your bottom dollar on it. You snort enough cocaine or amphetamine psychosis is a very well-known thing. And with Parkinsonian patients, when we give them levodopa, if we give them too much, they go psychotic. So, and if you image a patient, functional neuroimaging, while they're in the grips of a hallucination or a delusion, you see the seeking system light up like a Christmas tree. So, and incidentally, in dreams, the same system, and dreams are a psychotic state. So the role of dopamine and the seeking system in psychosis is assured. Now, how do we make sense of this neuropsychoanalytically? I want to take you back to what I said earlier. I said that seeking is involved in every drive. It's a matter of seeking deployed in the service of one of the other drives, as opposed to seeking just for its own sake. And people who are going to later become psychotic, it's got nothing to do with seeking. It's got to do with the fact that one or another of these demands upon us to perform mental work, one of the emotional needs that we have to develop a predictive model as to how to satisfy this need in relation to all the other needs, fails. We can't do it. There's no specific etiological or causal link between, say, lust and psychosis, or fear and psychosis, or panic grief and psychosis. It can be any of them. Frequently it's play, but it's just many times it's lust, many times it's fear, in my experience, and panic grief, let alone the other ones like postpartum psychosis and so on. Clearly that's dealing with care. So there's no special relationship between any one drive and psychosis, including seeking. So what is special about psychosis is not where is the repression in relation to which drive or which conflict between drives. That is the same as in any other psychopathology. The child can't cope with this or that or the other thing in terms of meeting their emotional needs in the world. Then they suffer, as we all do. What distinguishes psychosis is what defense do you use against your suffering. There are neurotic defenses, there are narcissistic defenses, and there are psychotic defenses. The psychotic defense is disavowal, Verleugnung in the German word that Freud uses. I think it's déni in the French. I'm not sure about French, but and I mentioned French because of Lacan, but Freud's term is Verleugnung. Strachey translates it as disavowal. It's a withdrawal from reality. And that's the silent prodromal phase of a psychotic illness. The kid withdraws. Why do they withdraw? It's because if you test your predictions in reality, they don't work. So that's when you suffer. Prediction error arises from engaging with reality. So I know what, I won't engage with reality, is the solution. But spot the mistake. We have to engage with reality because all of our drives can only be satisfied in relation to reality. But now here's the crucial bit. Through disavowal, through a withdrawal from reality, there's no prediction error now, because I'm no longer testing my predictions against reality. That allows the default mode of seeking to be prioritized. So the return to reality is through seeking, because the other needs are in a very deathly way, they are being satisfied in the sense only that you're not even trying to satisfy them. You've withdrawn from the object world. And so the return to the world is through seeking. And seeking is an engagement with uncertainty. But if it's unbridled, this is another whole thing I haven't gone into, that each one of these drives has a narcissistic disposition as opposed to an object-related disposition. Narcissistic seeking is omniscient. It is, I have explained all uncertainty. That's delusional certainty. It is imposing my predictive model on the world, ignoring all prediction error. The only thing you attend to is that which confirms your prediction. And this is the noisy part of psychosis. And that is what's driven by dopamine. Now, so that's not the illness; it's the defense in consequence of it's the defense in consequence of a failure, developmental failure, followed by the psychotic defense, followed by psychotic symptoms. The psychotic symptoms can be treated with dopamine blockers, but then you back to the kid who's withdrawn from the world, and that's when you can do therapy. Is that if you're so lucky as to be able to engage again with what was the problem that made the child withdraw from the world, or usually it's an adolescent, then you can engage again with the original cause of the problem. So that's in a very thumbnail sketch, a neuropsychoanalytic account of psychosis.
And in commentary on that, I think, and for potential Lacanian listeners, important to highlight. So, Mark, how Mark, you're situating the structural differential diagnosis is at the level of defense, which
Yes.
defenses come in to deal with the failure of the repressed predictions.
Absolutely.
And so it's if we can keep it, at least there are these two levels. There's repression and then there's defense. Note that Lacanians will say that the difference between, let's just say, neurosis and psychosis is that neurosis is characterized by repression versus psychosis is characterized by foreclosure. And so when Lacanian differential diagnosis is talking about repression versus foreclosure, I don't think they're saying the same thing as what you say, Mark, when you talk about repression.
No, they're not. No.
So the Lacan repression is not the same thing as the neuropsychoanalysis Mark's repression. And I hope the listeners grasp that what Lacan means by repression.
So what I mean by repression is the illegitimately automatized attempt to satisfy any drive. It's putting out of mind the problem that I don't know how to satisfy this drive. So I'm saying it works like this. That's what Freud calls a repressed wish. In other words, it's an unrealistic prediction. It's a childish solution. Then because by definition it doesn't work, otherwise we wouldn't call it illegitimate or premature. Because it doesn't work, it doesn't satisfy the drive or resolve the conflict, the child will suffer feelings. It's just that it'll no longer be able to think about, why am I suffering this feeling? It won't know where the feeling's coming from. What do we do with those feelings? We institute defenses against them. So repression and defense are not the same thing. That's the crucial point. The way that the Lacanians conceptualize it or taxonomize it as you just described it is actually very similar to how most psychoanalytical schools do. They say repression is a neurotic defense, a projective identification or projection and introjection or splitting is a narcissistic defense, and disavowal is a psychotic defense. Foreclosure, if you call it that, but it's so the idea is that repression is a neurotic defense. I don't agree with that. I think repression underlies all psychopathology. It's just it's a child not being able to satisfy its needs in the world and doing it in a way that doesn't work, and therefore they suffer. The defenses then are instituted against the suffering. The psychotic ones, you can call it foreclosure, or I don't know what that word means, but I know that what disavowal means. It's a withdrawal from reality. You can call it the narcissistic ones are projection and introjection. In other words, projecting out the source. The source of the suffering is in the object rather than in me. And in neurotic defenses, it's the aim or the object of the prediction is changed. It's called substitute formation, as opposed to the source being changed. The suffering is not coming from me, it's coming from you. It is changing the aim or the object of the prediction is the defense. And the defense against the suffering caused by the original repressed prediction. And there's some very nifty neurotic defenses like sublimation. We all have to use defenses because all of us institute repressions. But for me, the distinguishing feature of a neurotic defense is substitute formation in terms of aim and object. It's not repression. Repression is prior to all of them. I realized there was something I should have said earlier. I did mention dreams, but I want to just say again that when I say that seeking is prioritized because you've withdrawn from the world through disavowal, it's also prioritized when you go to sleep because you've withdrawn from the world. So seeking is prioritized during sleep because you don't have to satisfy any of your other needs then. Hence dreaming, which is a psychotic state.
And I think, Mark, what you just said, that the essence of neurotic defenses is the substitutive capacity, particularly for the aim and the object of the drive. To remind the Lacanians, how does Lacan define repression? It's the substitution of the unknown of the original object, the maternal object, with the symbolic metaphor stuff of the culture, the name of the father, the father function. It's a substitute function, and the minimal capacity to be able to use the things out there in the world, right? The cultural resources or linguistic resources to be able to substitute and then to deal with the original problem, the symptom core that you can't perfectly resolve. But okay, my attempt to deal with the leftovers is through I buy into the idea that, okay, this can be routed through linguistic resources, cultural resources in this sort of paternal substitution sense, versus in the foreclosure that Lacan talks about in psychosis. It's the foreclosure of this mechanism, of this recognition of that confidence that the substitution will be worth it. That it'll be enabled in that way. But yeah, I think that the differential diagnosis stuff is so interesting, and to clarify the levels, I think this makes good sense clinically too. When it's there is something in common between neurosis, psychosis, perversions, and all of these things. There is there is something that they're not as different as perhaps some of the immediate manifest phenomena can make us think. So I think finding that common ground is helpful too for how we approach patient work.
If you read Freud's Schreber case, you'll see his analysis of the repressions lying at the heart of the disorder, and he marvels at how, oh my gosh, it's the same old stuff, except this guy's dealing with it psychotically. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid we're going to have to end as far as I'm concerned. So I just want to say again, I hope I've indicated throughout our conversation how much I've enjoyed it. So thanks, Rahul, for hosting us, and thanks, John, for your mind and for contributing your intellect to, at least in part, to neuropsychoanalysis. I think we're very lucky to have you.
No
doubt.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Mark. It's not only so invigorating to engage and respond to all of your phenomenal work, but it's just fun. So, this is play. So it's really enjoyable.
Don't know why anyone does anything else.
Yeah. And thanks again, Mark, for dealing with all the technical issues. John, can you stay for 10 minutes longer? Is that okay? I've just got a few questions on the free energy principle.
Sure.
Yeah, I know that I mustn't switch off. I will leave the meeting and I'll leave my thing, because I know with Riverside you have to let it continue downloading.
I'm glad you're
okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much,
Cheers,
Mark.
Guys.
Thanks for your time. Cheers. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Awesome. That was fantastic, John. Yeah, I was going to say later on, but I think I'm going to re-listen. I'm already taking a lot of notes, copious amounts of notes, and then re-listen and reflect on some of this. But no, apropos the free energy principle, if you've got 10 more minutes, if that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, man. So I think this question is more for the Lacanians, because in fact, you're the first serious Lacanian I've come across truly working with FAP, active inference, and then broadly computational neuroscience. Because as you did say in your presentation to the Active Inference Institute, Lacanians tend to be a bit like anti-naturalist, so to speak, right? So this very pithy statement is apropos the free energy principle. You say, what does it mean when the system's efforts to minimize free energy inevitably produces more free energy or inevitably produces free energy? Along those lines, can you firstly, so a bipartite question, for those who aren't familiar with the FAP just in general, could you just briefly give a quick primer to that? And then, more importantly, explicate your Lacanian twist to the FAP, please.
Yeah, so free energy principle, it's a model in theoretic, or originally developed in theoretic biology, neurobiology, but it's been extended quite broadly to almost a theory of everything, to quote Friston's book in progress. So it's developed by Karl Friston, a computational neuroscientist and theoretic biologist and physicist. And the basic idea is that anything that exists as a thing, and what does it mean to be a thing? It means that it's distinct from what is not the thing. So, I am not anything beyond the boundaries of my skin. And so that's what it means to be a thing in a very basic sense. Anything that exists as a thing has to minimize free energy. And free energy, you can think about it as entropy, you can think about it as uncertainty, and it's this basic recognition that there is, the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy in a system increases. In other words, things dissipate to equilibrium. And it's a conundrum of life that biological organisms have to find some way to resist the second law of thermodynamics. And this gets applied in the free energy lens as all biological systems have to minimize free energy. And that therefore, everything that the system is doing things in some way to minimize free energy. All quantities that can change will change to minimize uncertainty. And so that's the sort of core of the free energy principle. And so the immediate sort of Lacanian criticism that I still hear a lot is like, this is too homeostatic. This is like, you're saying that everything we do is to get rid of uncertainty, get rid of the real. Nevertheless, as I was saying before, we know from clinical work that people will do things again and again and again and again that nevertheless keep their uncertainty going and keep, that are clearly not homeostatic. And therefore, this leads to the kind of criticism that, this isn't an applicable model to human psychology, subjective structure, and at odds, therefore, with Lacanian theory. And at this point, I think it's just useful to remember that on the one hand, yes, there is the real, but the essence of the imaginary and the symbolic is creating ways to deal somewhat with the real. That it's not just real, that's total chaos, that the symbolic and the imaginary, that these are ways of taming the real to a degree, not completely. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, and this is, I don't think it's a uniquely Lacanian view on the free energy principle, but I think it kind of helps draw this out from the way that the free energy principle language is usually presented, that yes, the system changes to minimize free energy, but nevertheless, the system never reaches that 0 point. Both for reasons that the outside world is super, super, super complicated, but also that, especially in at least mammalian and at least vertebrate biological organisms, that there is this thing called the seeking drive, that it leads to a proactive engagement with uncertainty, whether that's out in the world or within the model itself, in terms of uncertainty among, which predictions are best fitted to be dealing with this current situation, that itself is a kind of uncertainty. And so that there's this active engagement with uncertainty that keeps a dialectical tension within the system. That the system itself is a dynamic, ever-moving process. And one of the other things that is more recent within the free energy principle and things that Karl Friston has written on is that one way of approaching free energy principle minimization is this idea of a non-equilibrium steady state attractor. In less complicated terms, there's some non-equilibrium, i.e. not nirvana, not nothingness. So some non-equilibrium state that is steady for the system that it aspires to be toward. And this is a settling point or a homeostatic settling point that I don't want to have no uncertainty. That's just death, because then there's nothing to deal with. But there's a certain kind of point there. And that in one of the more recent formulations, it's not quite that the system gets to that point, or even that the system keeps striving to get to that point. It's and that's which is the minimization of free energy moving toward that point being one aspect of free energy minimization. But many dynamic systems, especially biological systems, demonstrate a kind of like a sinusoidal circling around that point. That what happens is the point toward which the organism strives, it's not only unreachable, but you kind of get into a rhythm around which, or sort of a pattern, a function that the system circulates around this point. And once the formulation takes that form, and I was glad when Karl pointed this out at the active inference talk, that this formulation, this is now getting closer to at least what I think that some of the Lacanian formulations are, where if the famous diagram in Seminar 11 on what a drive is, the drive circuit is there's the rim, the opening, the gap, there's some difference that has to be dealt with, and the route of the drive is around the object A, around the uncertainty in the other. So that around the uncertainty out there in the world that I have to deal with, that I never grasp, you never quite get at the thing, you never quite get at the state that would be perfect homeostasis. What the drive is and what the symptom that goes with the drive is, this for me is that core of the symptom that we were talking about earlier, that follows this repetitive circuitous route around this fantasized state. And this is, to me, the Lacanian interpretation of the death drive in the form of repetition compulsion. It's the repetitive circling around this thing that I'm trying to get toward. I fantasize that this would be the wholeness. I never actually get there. And therefore, I make the best do I can with encircling around this point, and it repeats. And yes, there might be variations in how I repeat it. There can be substitutions. There can be modifications, extensions in how I circle around it. But there will nevertheless be this circling dynamic, or this repetitive patterned dynamic to my actions, or to the predictive habitual ways that I engage with my uncertainty, as I have it dialectized between both myself and also somewhere out there in the world. So I think that this view that it's not just about hitting ground zero point of entropy, that there is the emergent dynamics that you get from free energy principle are very much dynamics that there's a constant interplay with uncertainty, that there's this proactive engagement and repetitive returning to uncertainty that is necessary for the system to exist. Because if there were no uncertainty, then
it'd be dead.
There would be no need for active engagements of anything, and so and that's death.
And you map it to the concept in FEP, the non-equilibrium homeostasis point.
Yeah. So the non-equilibrium steady state attractor, that it's not only
I misspoke.
it's not only a point that in my head, and perhaps I'm wrong, but in my head they're more or less the same concept that's trying to get at, of like a homeostatic settling point. That it's not only that this is the point that the system wants to be in, but there's a patterned circuitousness, particularly when it comes to the domain of action. Particularly when it comes, and we are acting beings. When it comes to, you have to return to a familiar state of acting. This is repetition.
Excellent. This has been an utter treat. Thanks, mate. And it's been, as you were saying, a great way to play. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Rahul. This was a pleasure.